Welcome to episode 9 in season 2 of the JAIAC's Dispute Management in the New World podcast series. In this episode, we take a look at Smokin Hot, Canna Talk, conversations about cannabis. We're joined again by Dr. Christopher Malcolm, Secretary General of the JAIAC. Welcome, Dr. Malcolm.
Thank you, Nika.
Doc, let's talk a little bit about something that is dear to most person's heart, cannabis.
I'm not so sure about how dear it is to most person's heart. What I do know is that the question of cannabis is something that has raised many areas of controversies all across the world and has done so for quite a while now. So when we speak about it, we should try to in any event have a better understanding of what gave rise to some of these concerns that we've had, what the current status is in relation to cannabis. And in this context, of course, we have to examine it by reference to the question of dispute management.
Okay, so let's just put some perspective on what we're talking about. Cannabis, some persons call it marijuana.
Marijuana, ganja, weed, it's called so many things. Kaya, it's called kasha, it's called, you can think of more names than you can imagine. It's called in different places in the world, but I think we all understand it to be an herb which is used in one place or another in different ways, and also has the notoriety of being considered unlawful or illegal in many jurisdictions across the world. Well, the notoriety stems from the fact that cannabis is considered to be a prohibited drug in most jurisdictions across the world. And it is therefore treated as, the use of cannabis is therefore treated as an illicit activity. That is the source of the notoriety related to it. But of course, what is important in this, and which also adds to the notoriety and all the mystique, if you want, around cannabis, is that notwithstanding that it is considered to be illicit, it is very well used across the world in a number of jurisdictions, not only for recreational purposes, but also for medicinal purposes, and is well recognized as well as having significant and very important medicinal value.
Let's talk about the current stance on the legal or illegal use of cannabis here in Jamaica.
Cannabis in Jamaica has not been legalized. What has happened is that there is a special legislative regime that has allowed for the decriminalization of small quantities. And it is important as well to note that while there's a decriminalization of use of small quantities, you may nevertheless still find yourself being brought to book and getting what in substance would be a traffic ticket in relation to if you're caught using small quantities of cannabis, but you will not get a criminal conviction arising from that. So if you were, for example, to go to Ecuador or some other places, you could have full legalization there. If you go to the US is a multiplicity of states with multiplicity of rules relating to cannabis. So there are some jurisdictions in the US which allow for effectively decriminalized use of it as well. There are others where and when I say decriminalized there, I mean both in relation to recreational as well as for medicinal purposes. If you go to places like Canada, the same thing operates where effectively you have had what is in substance legalization of the weed, as they would say. So you cannot use Jamaica or even a single federal state such as the US and say here's a position. At federal level in the US, ganja or cannabis is still prohibited. So while you may have state laws that allow for particular use of the weed or cannabis in particular ways, you still have the real possibility that while you may be compliant with state law, you could find yourself in a position of being in possession or use where you in fact could end up, depending on circumstances, being in breach of federal law. So that, I think, is, I wouldn't say it's schizophrenic because that sort of adds motive in a sort of a way. But what we can say is that there's a regime that has operated, in the case of the US, in a unitary state if you think of the US, even though it says these United States of America, if we're to think of it as a single state for these purposes, within it, you have varying positions as to the use of ganja and what it means.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the milestones that we've seen in terms of ganja and cannabis over those years.
Well, the milestones, I think, the first milestone for me, I think we go back about 100 or so years ago, just about, yes? Where there were efforts made. In fact, as I mentioned, there was a time in the US, and the US has driven global policy in a significant way, certainly in the Western Hemisphere, in relation to cannabis and how it is treated. And prior to a little less than or just about 100 years or so ago, you had a situation where in the US, the use of cannabis was not at all outlawed. But then it became caught up in this prohibition wave. And cannabis, the use of it then became prohibited, and it then became treated as an unlawful substance. And over that period, you have had a number of positions that have suddenly crept up and got worse. So for example, with Nixon in the 1970s with his significant war on drugs, then you had a very strong position being taken in relation to use and all sorts of things related to cannabis. And of course, in the US, if you look at it, a lot of persons there, their criminal and penal system has had a lot of persons incarcerated for the use of cannabis in circumstances, we said, where prohibition came about in a particular way. And as in every other jurisdiction, as was found with the case with alcohol where there was prohibition prior, you find that once there's prohibition, you then send up the profit stock in relation to its trade, right? If something is unlawful and persons want to get it, automatically prices move up, right? When things are lawful and easy and accessible for use, then prices tend to go down. And so what has happened, frankly, is that you've had a situation where you've had a growth in an underbelly industry related to cannabis, and all sorts of issues have been created around it. And I'm not speaking for myself here in this regard. There's a lot of statistics which is out there. If you look, there's a group that developed called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. And it developed out of the US. And the people who started that organization back in the 1970s were all persons who were former DEA agents and persons who were involved in the fight against drugs. And they got to a point where they thought that the prohibition battle was not in the best interest of populations, and that there were things that needed to have been done. That is not a fight that I wish to get into, because frankly, I'm not speaking as a scientist and I don't understand the science behind that, or even whether or not they're correct. Frankly, there are statistics that they've provided, but I would not be here necessarily to vouch for that in the context of this podcast. What I would say is that there is a dialogue that is required. What I would also say is that we are aware that in every society there's use of cannabis. We're also aware that there are developments in medicine that have come out of cannabis. In the case of Jamaica, for example, we have had Canna and other things being developed from cannabis, which have been shown to be effective treatments for glaucoma. And in the context of our societies, we know that there are persons who have cannabis which they use steeped in rum and in all sorts of things for pain and all sorts of things. So there's usage of it. Is it good usage? I can't speak from the science on it. But I can say that there's usage, and I can also say that what we found in the case of Jamaica, certainly when we moved to decriminalization, is that the legislature found that there were persons who were getting criminal records for the small usage of cannabis for smoking in circumstances where their futures were effectively ruined, for something which is used in a very pervasive way, even if not for smoking, for persons using it in all sorts of ways, for rubs and for pain relief and all sorts of things, and that is well known. So the question really has to be, when we're looking at policy and matters relating to that, how much should we be concerned about how we deal with our citizens for something which really, in a general sense, doesn't have the same sort of bad value as some other persons may think. And I think that is a discussion which really has to be had. And it's a discussion, quite frankly, which is itself rooted in some sort of conflict, and we can get into what that conflict is.
So decriminalization, in some sense, has been one of the major successes that we.
It has been a major success in the case of Jamaica, but there are other jurisdictions which have gone even further to legalization.
Right.
So those are
What
successes
are some
that
of the
we've seen.
issues now with legalization of cannabis?
Well, legalization of cannabis in any jurisdiction, let's say Jamaica, has to consider how it is that what you're doing factors into the global environment. So if you're thinking legalization, or you're thinking even of developing a business related to a legal substance, cannabis, you have to think, if we were to develop a business, are we going to be able to develop a bankable business?
Right.
Are we going to be able to develop a business where cash flows can be properly regulated through the formal banking system? All of those are questions to be asked. And the major limitation, I would say, is this. When you are developing any business, if you cannot regulate and enable effective cash flow and make a profit from it, which is legitimate and can be taken into the banking sector, you may as well not develop that business. Because businesses, by their very nature, must be developed and geared toward making profit and making money. Now, if in the case of Jamaica, for example, we were to legalize and establish businesses around cannabis, and in our major trading partner, the United States of America, and in the banking system that we're most connected to, there is not a basis for treating cannabis as legal, and therefore, monies coming out of it could then be treated as monies arising out of a business which is illicit, and therefore you're looking at money laundering and other things related to that, then you run into a real problem of creating a business which is at the very core unsustainable, and at the very core something which you are wasting time doing. In fact, even in the US, where in Colorado and other states, they have had effectively enabled mechanisms for treating with businesses in marijuana, there was a time where you had trailer loads, and we're talking about these 40-foot containers and so on, loaded with cash. Wow. Because the banks would not take them, their cash. And they were being guarded by security guards. Why? Because the banks are saying that even though within a state, we have state banks that are able to take your money, we function in a broader environment where we have to cross state lines in terms of the business that we do. And the state, across the state line banks that we're dealing with and the federal arrangement treats this activity as illegal. So we do not intend to delve into a business which will then put us on the basis of being considered institutions which are engaged in promoting or supporting illicit activity. Therefore, we be treated as though we're funnels for money laundering. So there are those issues which are real.
Mm-hmm. So the business of legalizing cannabis cannot be thought of in isolation of just development of that business. It has to be thought of on a more global and broader perspective.
And you're right. And in fact, when you're thinking about the business of legalization and establishing of businesses related to cannabis, the most important factor, in my view, is that you must first consider what are the available banking relationships that you can carve out. Mm-hmm. I will say to persons all the time that if you're setting up a business and you have no real capacity to engage banking services where you can allow for easy flow of cash, then you may as well not set it up. And I spoke in a previous podcast that we had about the nature of correspondent banking and the nature of being in an integrated ecosystem, financial markets integrated system, where you need to have monies flowing between jurisdictions and so on. Now, if it is, let's just take a little example flowing from this. Let's say there's a business A in Jamaica that is in the business of producing the best quality marijuana, cannabis, whatever you want to call it. And it is in high demand in, let's say, Canada. There's a Canadian market that you have that is readily available. You have a buyer who is prepared to buy as much as you can produce. In fact, they go further. They're prepared to give you all the investment you need to help you grow the business. Yes. But after you have produced that, and you then decide to sell it to them, you find yourself in a position where you have issues shipping the weed legally. Mm-hmm. Let's just use that for one moment. But then it goes further. You have a difficulty shipping it. So you now have an available market, you have an available product, but you cannot get it from the point of production to the point of demand. So already you have a problem.
Yes, you do.
But let us go a little further to say by chance, you're now able to move it from point of production to point of demand. But when you get there, the person now intends to transfer payment to you for what you have produced. And in trying to transfer the payment from a financial institution in Canada, and I haven't even gone to the US yet, I'm sticking with Canada.
Right.
Because Canada has a much more evolved and liberated position relating to ganja, right? But at that point, they decide that we're going to transfer payment back to you for the weed that you have produced. And in doing that, let's say you go to one of the major banks in Canada, whichever you may call, and that bank itself has a correspondent banking relationship with a major bank in the US. You know where we're going there. You now have a situation where they too have bankers that they must deal with and who must be satisfied with their internal due diligence and other procedures.
Right.
And in doing that business, the bank in Canada says, well, yeah, we're prepared to transfer the money back to you. But we are having a situation where our correspondent banks in the US have said that that business is illicit business and they're not prepared to engage with us if we maintain you as a customer. So what you now have happening is that with the best of intention, your buyer in Canada has money that he or she or it is prepared to pay, but the banking system will not readily allow for the transfer of funds back to you. In circumstances where what? You have already engaged and paid your laborers. You have already engaged and paid for your greenhouse. You have already engaged and paid for transportation. You have already engaged and paid for water. You have already engaged and paid for fertilizer. And you have already built a business which has now put you in debt. You have money that is capable of being collected to pay for those inputs that you have made, but you can't get it. What then happens to you? You then run into bankruptcy or insolvency, right?
Yes.
And so there is a chain where until you get to that point where the banking relationship can be seamless and you can move, then you have a difficulty. And because at the core of the problem is that you're functioning in a banking system where the principal player in that arrangement, being the US bank, is saying that it is an illicit activity and we're not prepared to support it unless and until they find themselves in a position where their federal laws and enabling environment allow them to allow for that transaction to happen. You have a roadblock which is difficult to surmount, and therein lies a major part of the difficulty that you will have.
The problem is twofold for this industry.
Yes.
It is on the lines of it being an illicit industry still,
Yes.
or an illicit product.
Yes.
In essence, and the banking relationships that are needed can't exist whilst that still pertains.
As a producer, you are engaged in a business. And with that in mind, you want to know that you have the capacity for money to move. Both money is coming in and money is going out. Now, if it is that is your concern, and you are not able to have monies moving, then the question becomes, are there limitations, or what are the things prohibiting the movement of money that you require? And I would go so far now as to say that the major limitation for the producer is the fact that the banking sector is unable to provide the level and quality of support that is required, right? And I'll hasten to add that it is not that the banks are spiteful and simply do not want to support the industry, but they are mindful that if they engage in an activity that is deemed to be illicit, it could undermine their very existence. So the banks therefore are conflicted in that they may want to support the industry, but they understand that their own viability and being able to remain afloat and alive could be threatened by giving very overt and real support to the industry. So that is, on the one hand, there's a level of conflict there from the banks. And that conflict for the banks, for example, in Jamaica, is a conflict between the local banks and particularly their correspondent banks that they cannot survive without. Right?
That's right.
Insofar as the producer is concerned, the producer's conflict is this. I am producing a product. I have a buyer who is able to take it. But if I send my product abroad, if I'm able to do that, I cannot get paid because even though my buyer is ready, willing, and able to pay me, that buyer is unable to transfer my monies to me. So what you will have to do then, therefore, is to recognize that there is, on the one hand, a producer, on the other hand, a bank. And when I say a bank, I mean your local bank, which is itself including a chain with its correspondent bank, right? So in that situation, you have this real conflict of a buyer, or a producer rather, wanting to make his product available and believing that the bank is his hindrance, right? And the banker who possibly want to support but cannot support because the regulatory and other environment in which it functions does not allow it to do so.
Right.
Is that something that is real? It is real, and that, I dare say, is the core of the major problem that the producers would have in a jurisdiction such as Jamaica.
Okay, so from the level of the banker and the producer, those two entities that you've identified, how do they now better manage those?
Well, what they have to do is, assuming, as I am doing for this conversation, that they have a common objective in trying to develop an industry which is capable of being profitable. And if it is profitable for the producer, it will be good for the banker as well.
That's right.
So let's say they have a common interest there. They need to be able to engage with each other. So there's need for effective communication from the banks to the producers to say, look, here is where the problems are. And we have a problem being able to support you for these reasons. Let us see how it is that we can work together through lobbies and through effective leadership being provided, including through the policymakers, to engage at international level so that the framework can be created to enable cash flow. And why have I said international level? Because the problem, for example, in Jamaica is not at local level. It is the fact that we are unable to engage effectively at international level to allow for the business to thrive and develop. So there has to be this ongoing effort and a recognition by all that unless and until significant change happens at global level, the resultant conflict of buyer being unable to effectively engage with seller, of seller being able to effectively engage with banker, and all of the conflicts that flow from that, including in particular conflicts related to correspondent banking relationships, will continue, and nothing much is going to change.
Who are some of the players in the cannabis industry?
Well, there's Canopy, and there are a number of players, quite a few of them coming out of Canada and Canadians and the US and so on. Interestingly enough, in the US, while at federal law, ganja is illicit, you do have some major players in parts of the US who are in the business. A lot of it medicinal, some of it for recreational purposes as well. Well, clearly, if you're thinking about the players in the industry, the players will include those persons who are in the nutraceutical business or in the business of producing medicinal things coming out of ganja. Right? So there are those players. There are, of course, research institutions that are in the business of researching and developing products coming out of ganja. So they're major players. You, of course, have persons who are prepared to underwrite financing related to the sector. And they are major players as well, because without money you can't have it happening. Then, of course, you have the growers of ganja. And importantly, you have the regulatory authorities. For example, in the context of Jamaica, we have a cannabis licensing authority, which has been specifically established to regulate the growing of ganja and to put measures in place to ensure that you have standards being kept and that people do what they're supposed to do. So if you get something that is supposed to provide for medicinal, you're not under the cover trying to deal with something which is recreational and so on. So there are those things that are happening, and they're fairly stringent standards that are maintained. But at core, it is a multiplicity of players, and that multiplicity, quite frankly, stretches all over the place. And it touches and concerns people in all sorts of offices. And in fact, I've heard it said, I've heard some preeminent persons at one level or another say, and in spaces which are quite public, that if, for example, you're in the US and you lived through the 60s and said you have never had an exposure to the weed, then you probably didn't live in the 60s in the US. I've heard that said. And I have heard others making all sorts of stories about what they do. And we do know, because these things are public, that there are persons in all sorts of industries who have, even if they're non-smokers, have said we have used cannabis-derived products to help us soothe pain and to do all sorts of things. We've heard that. So the fact of it having medicinal value is beyond doubt. Right. The question, of course, has always been whether or not the good value is outweighed by the bad experiences that can be created from it, whether it is in the nature of from a mental perspective or otherwise. And those are real issues. But the fact that they're real issues, in my mind, does not mean that you should not have an ongoing engagement in relation to it and in relation to what you do going forward for something which is not going to go away from us in any event. We have, notwithstanding the long period of prohibition, instead of the production of ganja going down, I would hazard a guess to say it has actually gone up in that period. What does that mean for prohibition? What does that mean for the way forward? There are things which are real, and I think that you have to engage with them as policymakers.
How are those players managing to stay in business?
Whether you're directly involved in production or indirectly involved in facilitating through the banking or other sector of cannabis in an illicit state, the repercussions for you would be huge, certainly if you're thinking about questions of de-risking and so on, right? If you're in the business of providing shipping services and you are directly involved in knowingly assisting for shipping to happen, then you're in a very difficult position. If you're in the business of shipping and people, through their own other illicit activity and whatever they do, then improperly use your shipping to facilitate, you could be in trouble, but for a different reason. Not because you knowingly assisted, but because you operated a business which itself became sufficiently porous for others to be able to take advantage of the porosity of the activity that you were carrying on. So there are different levels at which you have to look at it, because the truth be told is that there are some persons who knowingly get involved in activities, and there are others who unknowingly get involved in activities. Unfortunately, in some instances, the law treats those who are in the company, for example, of, as though you were just as involved. So if you're talking, for example, under Jamaican law, if we're to think about it, of being in legal possession of a firearm, for example, you could be in a motor car with somebody, have no idea that the gun was there, and yet still get charged together with the person who put the gun there for illegal possession of a firearm simply because you were at the wrong place at the wrong time. So there are those things that happen as well. And again, we can't be blinded so as not to recognize that. But we have to be mindful as well, though, that whatever the position that you're in, there's need for caution. And where cannabis is concerned, the caution that I always take in a business-related approach to it, which is what I'm taking, because my approach to cannabis is not from one who uses or wants to use it recreationally. Right. Not at all. Right. But I am looking at it by reference to the business activities that can relate to it. And we have heard and seen enough data to say that it can be a lucrative industry and could be an industry that some small societies could rely upon in support of their own development. So if we're taking that and saying this is an industry which could possibly be developed to support sustainable economic development, questions that I am interested in and that I think we all should be interested in. What then are the success factors, the critical success factors that must come to the table? What are some of the limitations to success? And how can we use and pool our resources to ensure that we identify them in a way that will allow us to develop a thriving industry and to have it work in support of the economies? That is where I come from. And as a dispute management practitioner coming back to home, I get back to the idea that once you're looking at businesses and business development and all the related contracts and arrangements around it, a critical component must be dispute management. And in relation to that, the question for me then is this: where are the areas of conflict? How are those conflicts to be best managed? You may be able to get the parties to a point of dialogue, amicable discussion, where they then devise a strategy, including a strategy in support of effective advocacy that can allow the needle to shift somehow. And if that were to happen, the role of the dispute management practitioner there is not one where you're trying to bring big lawsuits and all these other sorts of things, but more in a view to encouraging an amicable relationship which is geared to coming to a position that can be supported by all in terms of devising a way forward. And I think we have to now start thinking in a much more evolved way to say, in the same way that you had prohibition coming out of nothing, with effective advocacy, effective science, and effective everything coming together, it may be possible to get to a point where there's a clear recognition that further and other approaches may be necessary. And if we're able to get to that point, then we may be able to reduce the conflicts and the difficult position, the conflicted position, which our bankers are in, our producers are in, and our governments as well. Because it's one thing, for example, for a government to pass a law enabling for the development of an industry, but the industry can't go forward because there are underlying problems that prevent it from moving. And those are issues I think we have to find a way to deal with, and dispute management can help, because we're trained as dispute managers to identify problems, to find effective way of allocating risks related to those, and then to try to see as well how we can manage or mitigate those risks. And management or mitigation can sometimes lead to development of strategic intervention programs, including in relation to advocacy.
That's what he's talking about here, folks. Before we go, here's today's Did You Know fact. Did you know that ADR gives parties in a dispute the opportunity to work through disputed issues with the help of a neutral third party? It is generally faster and can be less expensive than going to court. When used appropriately, ADR can save a lot of time and could result in resolution within weeks or months compared to years in courts. I'm Anika Nelson on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm, saying thank you for joining us. It's sponsored by the JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC deposit insurance scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
The Caribbean Development Bank, reducing poverty and transforming lives through sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development. Special thanks to ADEB Consultants, consulting engineers in the Caribbean for over 57 years. Regis, work your way. Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution. Wassel & Wassel Arbitrator Services Incorporation. iNeutral Dispute Resolution Made Easy. CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner. And Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean.
The way we do business has changed. Don't be left behind. Choose a hybrid solution for your workforce. Regis offers furnished, equipped, ready-to-use office space available for days, months, or years. Our fully serviced private office spaces give teams of all sizes an inspiring environment to focus, collaborate, and do their best work. The world is switching to hassle-free hybrid working. Join the revolution. Switch to Regis. Call 876-618-8800 or visit regis.com.jm. That's regus.com.jm.
All our episodes are also distributed on Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.